Hi, I'm Glenn Maurer, and I'm here today with Bud Booth, and you're watching The Next Step. And today, Bud and I are going to talk about what the title of the show, as you see it on the screen, is The Business of Disasters. What made me think about this subject, which is intentionally meant to be provocative, was a story I saw in the paper last week about something called the Minamata Convention. The Minamata Convention. I have never heard of this. I didn't know anything about it. They're meeting, as it turns out, maybe I think it was this week, in Japan, and and I think it was because Obama couldn't go there because of the budget kerfuffle. So Americans weren't represented or something. I don't know if that was the same, but anyway, the point is, what is this Minamata Convention? I thought. International meeting of 180, 200 nations, and they're going to, it turns out, basically outlaw mercury in industrial purposes. And they mentioned that the mercury mining will be prohibited in the future, and mercury processing and whatnot. So I looked into this, and I found out that the Minamata Convention, which is being held in this area, Minamata, Japan, is in the near Minamata Bay, in the south of Japan, in the southern islands of Japan, and it was the site of what has been described as one of the world's worst environmental disasters. And Bud, I don't know if you heard about Minamata before.
I hadn't. No.
It may have been there in the media in the 50s, 60s, 70s, but it didn't register in my mind, and it certainly was forgotten by now. And here's the story of what happened in Minamata, Japan. The Chiso Corporation was a manufacturing company there, and from the 20s and the early 30s on, they were dumping their pollutants from their corporate activities into the Minamata Bay. And over time, the locals were eating the seafood and the fishes that came out of there, and they started developing these strange symptoms. They called it the something dance, the Minamata dance or something, and they would start, and what it was they were being poisoned with mercury and other chemicals that were being put into the seafood in the bay. When they figured this out, in the beginning they didn't know what it was, and the Chiso Corporation, of course, as all corporations do, first of all, they denied that there was anything that they were responsible for. Then they sort of accused the locals of being foolish people who didn't understand progress and didn't understand the world, and then they even hired the Yakuza. I mean, this is an interesting story. They hired the Yakuza to bully people. But finally, by the 60s, there was so much death and destruction, that 60,000 people suffered mercury poisoning. And by the time that this was brought to attention. And what they had to do, they went and stopped, and finally, by the late 50s, the Chiso Corporation was beaten back and agreed that they had been doing this, and they were stopped from doing anything further, and had to pay some token, I think by something like token reparations. But they basically put a huge fence around Minamata Bay to keep the seafood in, the sea fishes in, and to this day they cannot fish that fishery. Mm-hmm. So it occurred to me, doesn't this sound familiar? Yeah, and this is a corporation that went and just used the earth for its own convenient purposes, polluted the environment, and then fought being held responsible for it in terrible ways. And so I went back and I thought, well, let's do some other, let's go up to date to maybe Fukushima. So take a few steps along the way, and the other one that we remember was, say, Bhopal, or I remember this one pretty clearly. Remember Bhopal in India?
Oh, yes, in India, yes. How many thousands of people were killed, just outright killed?
Well, over 500,000 people suffered demonstrable damage from methyl gas. As you know, Union Carbide at the time, now owned by Dow Chemical, was building a chemical factory operating a chemical factory in India that was so poorly run that they had been warned by numerous people that this was going to blow. This was going to blow. They weren't using proper techniques. It was built in the area of slums and housing. And one night in 1984, this huge cloud blew up, and as you say, thousands of people, I think it was December 2nd, 1984, this 7 gas plant exploded, and over 500,000 people eventually were exposed to this toxic cloud of gas and other chemicals. And 4,000 deaths immediately confirmed, 3,700 and some deaths immediately confirmed. In the next decades, maybe 16,000 deaths, but hundreds of thousands. The government affidavit in 2006 said 558,000 people had been injured, physically injured by this by that time, and it's continuing because the ground is polluted. It's unusable to this day. The water wells in the area are unusable, and the poor people of India, and yet Dow Chemical, the successor to Union Carbide, says, no, we didn't do anything wrong, there's not a problem, and they gave out token payments because these are extremely poor people.
Did the head of Union Carbide suffer any consequences of that?
No, in fact, there's a warrant out for the arrest of the guy that was running Union Carbide in India, and maybe that's what you're remembering, and he's never been surrendered. Can you imagine, as we were talking about in a previous show, if India sent a team into the United States to grab this guy and bring him back to Bhopal for trial? Wouldn't that be something? But anyway, there's another one that most people have probably forgotten. So we've got the Niger Delta. Some people are aware of this because environmentalists like ourselves are. But in the Niger Delta, since 1970s on, Shell Oil Company has gone down there and tried to has produced oil. It's one of the major sources of domestic oil for the United States. The people of the Niger Delta live in filth and poverty and none of the money. And these things are constantly blowing up. Just a week ago, an explosion killed 200 people. One of these pipelines blew. Over the years, the worst one was in 1998. It had 1,000 people killed in an explosion. But they say that probably several 100,000 people have been killed, and the constant spill of these bad lines and these bad things. Now, some of it's because the locals are trying to steal oil because they're so poor.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
Yeah, you can't blame them. You can't blame the poor people for getting money any way they can, whether it's selling or transporting drugs or something that such as oil.
Shell is taking their resource, a limited resource, out of their country, and they're not benefiting from it.
Yeah.
So that aside, but the bottom line is, since 1970, they say that the spillage is equal to roughly 300 spills. I'm sorry, over 13 million barrels of oil, which is equivalent to having the Exxon Valdez spill every year for 40 years in a row. And Exxon Valdez going into the Delta, spilling the same load they spilled up in Alaska every year, 40 years in a row, would be the equivalent of the current damage already accomplished. Mm-hmm. Not talked about by us because we're getting oil and Shell, it's out of the side, and it's a business. Again, and this is not unknown to Shell. They know it. Union Carbide knew it. This Chisa company in Japan knew it. They knew that what they're doing is destroying a sizable part of the earth, maybe permanently, certainly for long, long periods of time.
But they're also aware that there will be no consequences to what they're doing.
That's right. So we bring up to BP and the Gulf oil spill. I mean, that's what comes to mind. And we're starting to forget that already.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, who is thinking about what's going on down there? We know that there's a huge spill, but out of sight, out of mind. You see these ads on TV?
Yeah.
Seafood from the Gulf, and what BP says we're trying to make it better. But what the fact of the matter is, number one, BP is lying, because of the oil that spilled. What was the number I saw here? I had some number here. 4.9 million barrels of crude is the estimate of. Now they're arguing about this, and BP says it's only 3.5 million or whatever, but the professionals seem to think it's almost 5 million barrels of oil came out of that broken thing. Almost 50 to 75% of it's still missing.
And where is this missing part?
Well, that's the point, isn't it? And because it's out of sight, out of mind, but now it's starting to come up. Just a few weeks ago, they had this thing called a oil mat, tar mat they call it, that washed up on the beaches off of Louisiana. It's the size of half a football field. It's congealed and collected tar, sand, oil, and seaweed that, and you know, it's been floating in the cold, deep, dark waters, congealing and congesting. And these things, 3 or 4 of them have rolled up in the last few months. Huge numbers of tar balls have rolled up. So this stuff is coming out constantly, and it will be coming out forever.
But we don't hear from our press that these things are happening.
That's my
now,
point.
I didn't know about this big, massive oil tar that was coming up on the beach. I never heard
Right,
about
and
that.
there's, yeah, and again, you know, it's up there, it's a day's story, and then it's forgotten. Nobody's following up, but there's been, I went back and did a little work on it and found out there's at least 3 or 4 of these have come up on, and they've closed that Louisiana coastline. Once again, the fishery there has been closed because all this new oil had to be hauled out and cleaned up and paid for, and yet BP acts like they're the victims. You know, BP is putting ads in the newspaper.
And on television, every day almost, you see an ad by BP, which incidentally used to be British Petroleum,
Right.
but they decided that BP was more American sounding than British.
Right, and they put a little daisy up there, a little green daisy and all that. But anyway, more than those ads that they're talking about, they're positive image ads where they, you know, even after lying about this for months when it was first happening, lying about the quantity that was being released, lying about what they had done to control it, and all those things, then they said, oh, we're going to fess up and pay off. Well, they're fessed up and they're paying off, and then of course people are being expecting to pay. So BP is putting ads in the paper saying that they're being asked to pay too much.
Yeah, yeah.
They're being asked to pay too much, and the reason that these people are demanding so much is because of what? Politicians and lawyers. So I mean, worse than oil companies apparently in the Madison Avenue idea is lawyers and politicians are even lower maybe in the public esteem than BP executives and that.
And these other oil companies, as you mentioned, Shell in the Niger Delta.
Right.
What oil company polluted down? I believe it's in Bolivia.
Oh yeah, Texaco, and they got bought out by Standard, and now that fight is going on too. And that whole thing in the Andes is still going on, and they. You know, Texaco sold to Chevron, and Chevron says, "Well, you can't sue us for what Texaco did." They tried to wash their hands, this little wash cell where they could get out from under the responsibility for this pollution they created down there, destroying the indigenous tribes and their ability to live their lives. Again, out of sight, out of mind, and tends to be forgotten, even if it makes a splash, and I don't like to use that word in the case of oil, but even if it makes a splash for a short time. And then finally, what really, and not finally, but the next step that really sort of got me to it, that is, because it's been bothering me for a couple years now, Fukushima. You know, Fukushima is a disaster.
Yeah, and you don't read about it in the press. You have to get publications from people who dig deeper than what the press looks for.
The American press, you know, I watched international news shows from France and Germany and occasionally from Japan, and you start seeing these reports, and there's a report of the water and the tanks leaking and the continued radiation and how people can't go there and all that, and then you go to American media,
Nothing.
no discussion of it, and so I went back and looked, and you know, I mean, Fukushima is a ongoing, continual disaster, and it's not just destroyed a sizable portion of arable land in northern Japan. It is leaking thousands of gallons. They have built 1,000 tanks to hold radioactive water.
That are leaking.
Yeah, and the tanks leak, and even when they don't leak, there's spillage. And then the water that's running out just naturally runs through this Fukushima area, through the nuclear plant. It gets contaminated and runs in the ocean. So 300 tons, they say, this is, TEPCO has lied. TEPCO is the Tokyo Electric Power Company, another private business, has lied about this, again, from the gate. They first denied that there was any problem, and they said it was this minor problem, and they said it under control. They didn't. And then they had restricted areas of
Oh,
evacuation.
and they knew, and they
They
knew
knew.
that they didn't, and they weren't going to get it under control. That, 3 of the 5 reactors actually were melting down.
They were melting down, and I'm not going to get into follow what they should have engineered to understand this or not, but I am bothered by the idea, which we see time and time and time again, that the business model says we don't fess up. People say, well, the free enterprise model, and you're held accountable for the risk you take, and if you lose, you pay, and you don't just get a get out of jail free card or anything. But of course they do, because number one, they can go bankrupt. Push comes to shove, they can just walk away from their messes up, or they can sell to somebody else and try to avoid it that way, or they can, or they can just hope it gets dissipated. And it does seem to me that the media tends to, I don't want to be conspiratorial, I don't know that it's intentional, but how can it be that the media does not pay attention to Fukushima in the west coast of the United States? Every once in a while we see a story about a barge washing up or something like that, but the radioactive water that's spilling into Fukushima Bay is now coming around the course, and by 2014 it'll be along the west coast of the United States.
Well, no, I didn't know that, but we do know that the Japanese current flows
Right.
up through the Gulf of Alaska and then down
Right.
the west coast of the United States. We know by our very weather results that that's what has
That's
happened.
exactly right, and that's why water in the west is cold,
Yeah.
because it's getting cold water from that northern thing, and that water's coming down here. So October 3rd, there was a leak of a new spill of water through this thing. The toxicity, the radioactive toxicity of this leak, according to what I read, 6,700 times the legal limit. And there is no end in sight. They're now talking about to freeze this land.
That was interesting.
Yeah, they want to try to put things in the ground and freeze the land and make a ice dam barrier, so the water that runs off the mountains behind the factory will be diverted around it, I suppose. But that doesn't do anything about the actual nuclear meltdown that's occurring on site. And all the water they've stored there already, and all the water they can't get out, and nobody's talking about what they're going to do with this stuff. And if you go online and read this stuff, and this was chilling to me, all the stories say, well, if you throw this in the ocean, it's just, it's like 0.000532% of the ocean's
Of the water that's in the ocean.
yeah, right. So we don't need to worry about it.
Yeah.
The ocean is a dump, and we can just throw our waste in there and fill it up with pollution and radioactivity, and the fish will eat it, but eventually the other fish will eat them, and eventually I don't know what.
No.
And they're talking about 30-year half-life, as though this has got a short half-life, it's only 30 years. It's like,
Whereas many of the elements have half-life in the thousands of years.
but 30 years of a half-life still means it's another half to
Yeah, it's still-
and it keeps going down, and and people are eating, it's another insult to the earth.
Yeah.
And it's another insult to this corporation, TEPCO, cannot be held accountable for. They cannot be. There wouldn't be enough money in TEPCO, no matter what happened, to pay for the damage they've done.
And what is being paid to the people that, they're getting their electric rates raised to pay just the bare minimum that TEPCO is.
Right, because they can't,
responsible for.
and so, which brings me back to sort of what I hope would be the theme or discussion of this show is, why we need government. This pretense that people have that government serves no purpose, and that unregulated industry is to be trusted and will ethically conduct itself in behavior, and will not lie to us, as we know TEPCO did, as we know BP is doing, as we know that Chaseco company in Minamata Bay did. They all lie, and the idea that you can trust these profit-making companies to do the right thing, quote unquote, is really upsetting.
They will do anything for the greed of money. And it has been happening now for many, many years before I knew anything about it. I think back to, and I don't know what company it was, but they were dumping their barrels of waste into Lake Superior.
Well-
and they're just now finding out that these barrels are now starting to bust
Right
open.
out.
And
Well, when we used to go fishing off of Palos Verdes Peninsula near San Pedro in Los Angeles area, and there was one area out there that never seemed to have much fishing in it off of White Point. And we would go down there and come back, and it was always curious. We found out later that a factory in LA Harbor company was taking arsenic and dumping their arsenic out there. And that whole area has been polluted permanently for 50 or 70 years. Has been a zone that needs to be cleaned up. So that's just in our own little neighborhood. My own neighborhood as a child that I saw this. So this idea that we can make these, so you mentioned companies dumping Love Canal. The Hooker Chemical Company, which was a subsidiary of Occidental Petroleum, another major oil company. I had to go back and look this up and remember what the Love Canal mess was about. What it was an abandoned canal in New York or Niagara area had been abandoned, and the local companies had taken to throwing their waste into there. Cheap, out of sight, out of mind. And then when they filled up that, they filled it with this awful conglomeration of really dangerous stuff. They put soil over it and essentially built on and around it and put tract homes and schools and all there. And that's what bubbled up and got these people all sick. And then became the disaster of Love Canal, which we hear about. Same issue, a private company taking the cheapest way out, no government oversight or regulation. And so it's upsetting to me to watch, let's say the Republicans are the most vehement, but the Democrats, the Clinton Democrats have for 20 years now apologized for and tried to deregulate banks and every other industry in this country to the detriment of the citizens of this country.
brings to mind the uranium mining down in Nevada and I guess New Mexico, Arizona, all that four square area that they used that tailings from those mines to fill out to level ground to build housing for the Indians.
That's right.
And now they're dying from radioactivity from these tailings.
Or another example is American federal lands. You can go in there and stake a claim on a mine or something for really cheap money. You can get a right to exploit whatever mineral deposits there. There's this Canadian gold mining company that's, I don't remember the name right now, that's famous for doing this, and they've got these. But when they leave, when they go in there and mine, and they use mercury and other bad chemicals
for gold
to
mining,
clean out that
mercury
stuff, they just leave the pits of this awful material there without even having to clean it up. They don't have to fill in their mines, which is bad enough, or even block them off. So they remain hazards to the people who go there, but they also leave toxic and other materials. So I think we have to remember these things when we're looking at why, if you and I engage in conduct that messes up our neighborhood or harms our neighbors, we're going to be accountable for that.
Yeah, which we should be.
We should be. But too big to fail is a phrase that doesn't just apply to banks, apparently. It applies to all these companies. They'll say, well, Union Carbide or Dow Chemical is a huge employer of people in India. And even though they pay slave labor or less, and even though their working conditions are grotesquely threatening, we need them because we don't have any other employers. So we excuse them from being responsible for the messes they've made. And if anybody says to them, well, you should pay a tax on the product you're making so that you will have a fund to pay back the damage you do if it comes that way. Oh, no, you'll harm the consumers.
Yeah.
And so, how do we get through to the general public the need to have a more, what I would say the Western European countries have, where they seem to understand that the process of manufacturing and industrialization has costs.
Yeah, and it harms the people that are less able to accept that harm.
right.
They use the term job killers. Anytime you try and regulate an organization, the cry is, oh, if you excess regulations are job killers.
Right. So we need, number one, people should, every time they hear that idea that it's a job killer, you stop thinking about what is it that what kind of job is it to begin with. This may well be a $5 an hour, burger job. But also, there's no reason you can't raise the price of a product to compensate for the cost of the regulations, which are pretty small. I once saw some data about if they raise the hourly wage in Florida of the citrus pickers and the farm workers to, I think it was minimum wage or $10 an hour or something like that, the cost of a carton of orange juice in your supermarket would go up 12 cents.
Yeah.
Now, I would pay 12 cents
Sure.
to know that the workers were getting this.
A similar situation was the tomato growers down in Florida, which they finally did get a little bit of compensation for, but for these many years, those poor pickers down there were making less than slave labor,
Right.
and the big fast food places were making out like burglars. In fact, you might even say they were burglars.
Hamburglers. But yeah, so the point I want to get back to is that I think, I'm hoping that the audience and others who listen to these type of things will stop and think about this 50 and 70-year history that I've tried to cover very superficially here of these major disasters in the world which have left permanent scars on the landscape caused by businesses who were in it for the profit, who wouldn't pay up for the costs of the damage they did, and that left us all holding the bag, and left a less healthy earth, left us all in a less nice place. And the idea that they should be required to take care of the things they've done badly, and maybe even have some protection and have regulation up front to review what they're doing, doesn't seem so bad to me.
And the Republicans in particular keep talking about too much regulations. We have too much regulations. Actually, we have too little regulations. That things, just as Glenn has pointed out here, where the lack of regulations hurts,
Right.
and particularly in foreign countries.
Well, and we will have a show someday on these trade programs with international or overseas countries who are going to be allowed to have these same kind of cheap labor conditions there outside what you could never tolerate here. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so think about what it is when these companies complain about regulation and being abused, and support some purview oversight. There's a reason for government. The government is often the only bulwark between greed and your safety and your family's safety and the environment that you live in.
Excellent point. So when they try and give you this baloney about over regulations, it's really under regulations in most cases.
We're running out of time.